Welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast, Episode 1, A World Turned Upside Down. I'm Michael LeBlanc.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Well, Steve, welcome. This is our inaugural episode. I'm very excited. Excited to be working with you. Excited to have the opportunity over the next 15 episodes of the first season to just talk about retail, remarkable retail, interview such interesting people. We got a great guest today to kick us off, Sucharita from Forrester. I couldn't, you and I were talking about comparing notes about who we'd love to have on the podcast, and she came up to the top of the list for both of our lists. So it's so wonderful that she was able to join us, and we'll have a great discussion we'll listen to a bit later. But I go back to when you and I first met, and then even back to a year ago, we were kind of talking about a podcast, and this was even before you had launched your book. But the idea here, and I loved your idea. I wanted you to talk me through it a little bit and talk about the book and then the rationale for the podcast that we talked about is, you've got this great book that not only provides a look at the history and the current events, but also a formula for retailers to be, as you say, remarkable. But now we've got this podcast, which flexes in a different way. It's not the audio book. It's not the book. It's something different. Talk about, as you thought about when we talked about a podcast, how you envisioned this and why we're doing what we're doing.
Sure. So I think the idea of the podcast and these 15 episodes is to walk through the concepts in the book, not literally chapter by chapter, but to cover the themes and be able to have a conversation about it. And also because obviously the book was written, largely done almost a year ago, we can bring a lot of the ideas into the current environment, which is obviously quite dynamic by virtue of the pandemic. So I think
I'm sure you had no idea about how dynamic it would be.
Well, first of all, I often say that I never call myself a futurist because I've noticed a lot of futurists are wrong a lot anyway. But also, I certainly don't have a crystal ball, or if I had one, it was quite faulty because I did not saw some other things coming, but I certainly didn't see the pandemic coming. So I think the podcast is an opportunity to go through the material in a little bit different way, not a lecture, but conversation, and also bring in guests to talk about some of the themes and really talk about some of the things that are going on right now and we expect for the future.
And what I liked about the format when you first talked about it was, as you said, it allows you to kind of frame around a discussion, but then put some contemporary examples to it. Now, whether or not, I think it would have been a good idea to have such a format, whether it was in a pandemic or not. I mean, retail still moves pretty quick. So I really liked it. I liked it from that perspective. And for the listeners who may have the book and maybe listen to it as an audio book, I thought it was a nice way to add to versus duplicate some of the content. So, but let's talk about the book. Where did the idea first come to write the book, and how did you approach it? Let's talk about the tradecraft and your ideas around the book itself.
Sure. So I think at the risk of being a little cliche, writing a book was on my bucket list, I would say. The question was, what was it going to be about? And did I feel like I had enough good ideas to share?
Right.
And one of the things that was really helpful, both of us do a fair amount of speaking now virtually, not in person, but over the last 3 or 4 years, I did quite a lot of keynotes and some workshops. And as I was preparing for those, I was just working on some of these themes, and some of the themes, which maybe we'll talk about in later episodes, came out of very specific things that I did either at corporate jobs I had or with clients. But I started to coalesce around this framework of 8 essentials and some of the storytelling around that. So probably about a year and a half ago, I felt like I had it worked out at a high level well enough. And then it was a matter of sitting down and actually writing the damn thing, which is a little harder than I imagine, even with all the writing I've done over the years.
Take us through those 8 essentials, because they do provide the framework for later episodes. So I think it's worthwhile just at a very high level, because again, we'll get into the 8 essentials. And for those listening who perhaps haven't read the book, it's such a popular book, but not everyone has it on their shelves yet. But hopefully we'll resolve that too. But these eight things, take us through them and walk us through each quickly. And again, we'll be spending much more time on them in specific episodes later in the series.
First of all, I decided to call them essentials rather than steps because they're not a linear progression. But what I found pretty comprehensively was that these elements or essentials were really part of every successful retailer's strategy that I had looked at. The first six, which I'll talk about in a second, I think are rapidly becoming table stakes, where in other words, if you aren't pretty good at them, you're probably falling behind. And the last two tend to be more differentiators. But just quickly, the 8 are, number one is digitally enabled. So this is really how digital really affects your whole business system, though I'm careful to say it's not really digital first, because analog, I think, can be an important part of a strategy. The second is human-centered, which is kind of my take on customer-centric, but I really want to expand it more broadly because I think successful enterprises certainly are customer-obsessed or customer-centric or whatever you want to call it. But I think starting to think more about community and your sales associates and the world more broadly is becoming an important piece of it. The third is harmonized, which is my term for omni-channel, and I explain why I think harmonized is fundamentally a better term, but that's a topic for a different day. The fourth is mobile. Obviously, we've seen more and more shopping journeys starting in digital channels, but increasingly, that's really the mobile device. And so how mobile fits into the shopping journey in your strategy is critical. Fifth is personal, which is really this idea of being more targeted, ideally on a one-to-one basis, to be more relevant and more differentiated. Sixth is connected, which is a pretty broad topic, but I think it's fundamentally about how we are as a society, for better or worse, just more connected to people, but also businesses are way more connected in terms of integrated supply chain and things like that. And then, like I said, the last two are really the differentiators. So number 7 is memorable. How do you create that value proposition that is very distinctive, but also creates much more of an emotional bond with that customer that they, in fact, not only keep coming back to you, but tell their friends about it. And then the last is radical, which is really about innovation and building a culture of experimentation, which I think obviously is becoming increasingly important in retail.
Right on. And we're going to have guests who more or less kind of align to each of those. So lots of interesting discussion around that framework to happen. Let's start. Take me back a little bit to the before time, as I've started to call it, pre-COVID, which it's only been 7 months, but it does feel like a long time. Yeah. I've often asked to kind of in 30 seconds or less explain what was going on in retail, and I've said, listen, retail. If you only give me 30 seconds, I'll say it's bifurcating. It's either luxury or value, or it's experience or efficiency on kind of two metrics. That's a very simple view. Right. Take me through how you described it as shift happens. Talk about retail, before January 2020, which is actually the last time we talked for the Voice of Retail podcast. But take me through that shift happens idea to set the framework for where we started this journey back in 2019 and before that.
I'll try not to do too much of a history lesson, but I think as you all know, retail has always been incredibly dynamic. Way back when you had shopping malls and the suburbanization of retail, then you had the emergence of discount mass merchandisers like Walmart, Target. Mm-hmm. Then you had an era of category killers, Home Depot, Lowe's, Best Buy, et cetera. But the shift that I talk about in the book, I think really started to happen about 20 years ago. And the first shift was the advent of e-commerce. And I was fortunate, I guess, to work on some .com related things more than 20 years ago. But I think even at the early stages, you could start to see how e-commerce was going to basically cause major disruption to certain categories for sure, pretty quickly, books, music, being the obvious ones, but also bring the channels together, merge the world between physical stores and at the time was largely mail order catalog businesses. So that was the first one. The second one I started to see probably about 10 years ago, and you were talking about this, which was what I've started to call over time the collapse of the middle. As you were talking about, if you look at the businesses that were gaining share compared to the ones that were losing, you tended to see this kind of barbell or bifurcation effect, as you start to allude to, which is you have lots of these more value, convenience, kind of efficiency retailers gaining share, opening stores. Then largely you had Amazon from an online perspective. And then you had the other end of the spectrum, which was more specialty retailers, tended to be high end. But the retailers in the middle, which certainly is characterized by a lot of the department stores, but not just department stores, that didn't clearly stand for either one of those points of the spectrum, were really starting to lose share. And that's only picked up pace in the last few years. The other one I'll mention quickly is I think a big acceleration really started when smartphones started to become ubiquitous, because that then put stores basically on your person anytime you wanted to shop. And I think that really helped accelerate a lot of the shifts. So really the last 20 years, I think, has been characterized by digital disruption, shifting consumer expectations, and then certainly this bifurcation effect of kind of the winners and losers really becoming more pronounced.
It's really the intersection of so many of those big picture trends. I often would say, if you're in the middle of the road, if you're on the left or right side of the road, you're okay. If you're in the middle of the road, you could be roadkill, to use one phrase. I think that's a less eloquent way of saying what you're talking about is the erosion of the middle. So, I mean, by the time the book came out in the spring, you probably put the last edits to bed in late December. If you were to write the book differently, I mean, you finished the book before the pandemic, and this is a bit of an unfair question because we're not really through the pandemic yet.
Right.
I mean, we're basically in the first or second phase of the COVID era. It could last in one way, shape, or form much longer. What would you change? What I might be asking you this many times. We might be talking about this many times over the course of the series, but off the top of your head, what are the kind of things that jumped out at you and said, boy, this is really different, and I would have written about it, and I would have written maybe something a bit different? There's
not a ton that I would write differently. I mean, obviously, COVID happened. Clearly
that was different.
I would have to make reference to it. Yeah. One of the things I've been writing about and speaking about for years has been these unremarkable retailers that I see approaching a precipice for many of the things we already talked about, that the middle was collapsing, that even very good is not good enough anymore. In the US in particular and a few other markets, you also have this overstoring, this too much capacity chasing too little demand. So a lot of the fundamental trends I was worrying about basically led to saying, look, many retailers are edging ever closer to the precipice and really need, based upon a bunch of other things I go into, to accelerate their transformation, or they risk being, as you said, roadkill. Now, I think what we've seen is some of the things that, frankly, I would have thought would take 3, 4, 5 years to manifest have manifested in a matter of months. So I think the core trends are still there. I just had an opportunity to talk about the 8 essentials in fair amount of depth last week. And really, none of the 8 essentials has changed. It's just we've seen an acceleration in a lot of the trends, and some of the competitors, frankly, that still had some life in them are gone or may soon be gone.
Well, it's interesting, and again, we'll be picking up on these themes, that this too much supply for the demand. What struck me, particularly in the U.S. market, is the resilience of the American shopper. And last year and the year before, and then so far, even in the pandemic, the shopper's been amazingly resilient. In other words, sales overall in retail have gone up, not down. I think what was it last year? Sales in retail were up 4 or 5% in holiday, which is just massive, right? It's a massive amount of sales. But so there's dollars up to grab, but it was still, the feeling was it was still overstored, and just even more so, the drive to be relevant and remarkable. Just to pick up on your theme, that's why I love the theme of the book, because if not, there's the sales to be had, but at the same time, there's the risk of just being pushed aside, as whether it was just competition you weren't keeping up, or now troubles within the pandemic. Let's bring on our interview with Sucharita. As I said at the beginning, such a great guest. Welcome the opportunity to speak to her on our first episode. So let's have a listen. Sucharita, welcome to the Remarkable Retail Podcast. How are you doing this afternoon?
I am doing very well. Thank you, Michael.
Well, it is the inaugural episode of our podcast. You're our first interview. I couldn't think of a better first interview. Steve and I compared notes as we started to look at who we would want to talk to and fill out as we think about remarkable retail, and your name came to the top of both our lists. So we're so excited you were able to join us. Why don't we just jump right in? I know you well. You've been on the Voice of Retail podcast, but perhaps for listeners who may not know enough about you or as much as we do, tell us a bit about yourself, the work you do at Forrester, and a bit about Forrester.
Yeah, so I am a retail analyst at a technology research company called Forrester, and I've been at Forrester since 2005, working with retailers and companies that support retailers in a lot of the issues that are related to digital transformation, e-commerce, cross-channel retail, and all of the innovations in between, whether it's mobile developments or social commerce developments. So that is a lot of what we do is work with companies on their retail strategy and their retail transformation strategies. Forrester is it's broader than retail. We have a retail team with about a dozen people who focus on different parts of retail technology and retail digital execution. And the rest of the company works on all sorts of technology-related issues that cross different industries and different disciplines within a tech stack.
Forrester and I go back a long way, back to the late 90s. In fact, I just had the opportunity to interview Kate Delhagen and Bill Bass, early members of the Forrester team. So it's been a long, great relationship and insights. Everyone used to ask me in the late 90s how I had a crystal ball. I said, I don't have a crystal ball. I have a Forrester subscription. So,
wow. They're Kate and Bill are legends.
Yeah, they're just such fantastic work, and you continue the tradition. Now let's jump into the before time. So if we remember this pre-COVID stuff, actually, Steve, you and I, and Sucharita, you and I both spoke at the NRF Big Show in January, and part of that discussion was around, what is the future? Where is retail going? And in the opening of his book, Steve talks about an epic revolution and profound shifts that had happened in the 2 decades. So again, pre-COVID, if you can remember the before time, what was your take on where retail was headed?
Pre-COVID, I think that the impression was that every sector, including grocery and big box, was challenged. And I think that some of that narrative has shifted a bit as a result of what's happened with essential retailers through the midst of COVID. But let's not forget, even before COVID, even the essential retailers were seen as being pretty vulnerable. A lot of the trends that we had been seeing, I think, have just been accelerated. A lot of the digital transformation trends, the push toward e-commerce and online selling, digital sophistication. We've been talking about this concept of omni-channel for decades. And I think that what's really happened is that COVID has forced people to execute much, much more quickly. And if something was on their to-do list, to accelerate it and put it into place immediately. And if they were executing it, to get their act together and to make sure that it was actually best in class. So I think that those have been the biggest changes that I've seen.
I'm curious, Sucharita. I wrote a thing for Forbes a couple months back now, I guess, but why is it you think it takes a crisis for so many retailers to get innovative?
Well, I think, Steve, that they, it lights the fire, because if they don't, they won't survive. If you take something as simple as curbside pickup, which people had been talking about for so long, there were always 150 reasons why it wouldn't work. And there were always reasons given, as to why it shouldn't happen. It could be anything from other things need to take priority to it could be a failure to, I think retailers had a habit of letting, everything had to be perfect. And,
Right.
And that was the challenge, whereas the pandemic forced companies to just get to good enough and, to get to execution. And then once you get to execution, you can work out all of the little tweaks later on. And it was really unprecedented, right? The closing of stores, something that had never happened before. And that forced them to be really, really creative and thinking about how else could they retain customers. And you will always have departments of no at every large company, including retail. And
including some I worked for.
Yeah. I mean, it's everywhere. I mean, we all have, we all face that in our day to day, right? And the thing is that nothing is going to, shut down that department of no faster than the fact that, kind of your regular means of making money are closed.
As you know, we're calling this episode A World Turned Upside Down. And I think you just were alluding to some things with respect to this, that obviously we've seen a ton of change over the last couple of decades. It's been accelerating, but then the pandemic comes along, and not only are those trends accelerating, but as you pointed out, you have things like stores being closed down, customers shifting preferences towards essentials, reallocating their spending towards things like health and fitness and so forth. I'm curious what you think have been some of the most important impacts in the past 6 months or so.
I think that the biggest changes that I've seen have been certainly the push toward more consumers being familiar with e-commerce, ordering a broader variety of categories in e-commerce than ever before. I mean, we have to remember that most Americans were already shopping online prior to the pandemic. What the big shift was that they broadened the stores that they had visited. They purchased more categories online than they had purchased before. And it was often new categories that they had never considered buying before. Like, for instance, grocery, which prior to the pandemic had like a low double-digit penetration in e-commerce, and that grew pretty substantially through the course of the pandemic. Now, I don't necessarily know that all of that's going to stick, because consumers will likely go back to stores and they'll eat out at restaurants, which will also decrease some of that grocery penetration. But it has made them familiar with the behavior that they hadn't done before. And, kind of even if some of that sticks, that accelerates the penetration. And we do forecasts every year at Forrester, 5-year forecasts. We had a pre-COVID forecast, and then we had to adjust it into the pandemic. And the COVID adjusted forecast has us leapfrogging the old forecast by 2 years from an e-commerce standpoint, and a little bit faster than that for grocery.
Wow.
And I think that the really important thing is, kind of going into the pandemic, Amazon was really seen as unstoppable in a lot of ways. And I think it's still huge and successful, and it's done very, very well through the course of the pandemic. But one of the little known data points that has come out from a lot of, come from some various research sources that we have, are that more consumers have tried new destinations that they hadn't considered before as a result of the pandemic. And that could be because they were bored. It could be that, the stores that they wanted to purchase something from was out of stock. It could be that they were just looking for items that nobody else had. But all of those reasons exposed people to companies that they hadn't seen before. And I think that anything that's going to break consumer habits is always promising for everybody in retail, because it gives hope for new businesses.
I'm curious if you have a perspective. One of the things I've been saying for a while, and probably have been mostly proved wrong, is that some of the underlying profit issues in e-commerce were at some point going to mitigate some of the growth. And I think we're certainly seeing some pretty expensive deployments on the part of retailers responding to the pandemic, but obviously those could be more short-term hits than long-term. Are you concerned about e-commerce profitability going forward? And I guess what are some of the things retailers might have to do to make e-commerce more profitable for them?
Oh, yeah, sure, Steve. And not only am I concerned about the profitability itself, which is largely challenged because the fulfillment costs are so out of control, but I'm also concerned about regulation that may be coming down the pike, because you have just, especially dense urban areas are having, as it is, like the carriers are some of the largest recipients of parking tickets in New York City, so, and that was even before, the e-commerce really started to take off. So this is something that this is not only kind of a challenge financially, but there are a lot of negative externalities that communities will undoubtedly, especially challenged financial, communities that are challenged financially are going to have to contend with as well. In terms of how do you address that? I mean, that's the beauty of these retailers that have physical stores, is that they can actually leverage those stores to create new solutions, whether it is that the stores become pickup points, or stores become dropship facilities, or stores become, places where other brands or other retailers can maintain some of that inventory. The importance of, because we have so much physical real estate in this country, some of it's going to shake out and have to get redeveloped. A lot of it is still going to stick around and probably become less productive in the traditional ways that we know retail to be. But that space still makes a lot of sense from the standpoint that it's for retail, and that it's proximate to consumers, it's proximate to households. Maybe it's not necessarily a destination that people go and shop around, but is it the destination that is where people pick items up from, or is it a place where they're just different models? I mean, maybe we go back to some of the retail becoming like the service merchandise or the old David Wise model, where you aren't as inventory heavy, but for consumers that want to touch and feel things, you do that, and then you may have some kind of a micro fulfillment center either in that facility or nearby to help manage getting the inventory to customers, but without being too too overbought on the inventory. And also we do have to balance. I think that a lot of our packages are getting to us in a way that is just not sustainable. I mean, you don't need to get like a nail clipper in the mail, same day. That's not a good use of anybody's resources. And we need to get over that. Cities need to tax that. There needs to be a better solution than what we have. Now, that doesn't mean that some types of transactions can't get there same day, but it's a little excessive now, and that needs to be regulated against or somehow shut down. I mean, Amazon has single-handedly been the driver of that ultra fast shipment where we just don't need it, but it's put the pressure on everybody else to deliver, kind of at an equally unsustainable level, and that needs to stop.
Well, I certainly agree. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out. One of the things I found really ironic, I was talking to a client about this last week because they've experienced a significant increase in store pickup and store fulfillment, as you were talking about. The irony is during most of the 90s and probably into the 2000s, the trend was to get rid of as much non-selling space in stores as possible. And now we're starting to go in the other direction where, potentially the back of the house is almost as big as the front of the house, or I guess Whole Foods and others are experimenting with these fulfillment stores only. So yeah, it's really, really interesting change.
Right. And I mean, the challenge is that this real estate's expensive real estate, right? I mean, because if you're going to have a warehouse, do you want it in like a commercial area that you're paying pretty expensive rents for versus, kind of your traditional DC rent, which is, and therein lies, the challenge is how do you make the economics of something like that sustainable? And is it stores within stores, or, do you convert the space, to something else? I remember there was a store called Marine Layer. They have a store, I think they still have a store in Portland where the top floor is like an Airbnb rental. So maybe do some of these stores just think really creatively about the space and what else can you do with that square footage?
I mean, as you think about the world here, that's very uncertain. At least that would be my perspective. It's really hard to know when we will start to get beyond some of the big impacts from COVID. Do you think retailers will be fundamentally changed in the way they approach their strategy and innovation going forward?
Well, I think a lot of them aren't going to be around. So in that regard, they'll be very, very changed. I do think that some who have embraced this opportunity for transformation will be substantially different.
I want to quickly pull on a couple of threads that you brought up. First of all, congratulations on coming up with this whole new media or whole new model for municipalities to fund tax base, and that's parking tickets. It's funny. I looked when you said that, I looked at the other side of that. Wait a minute. If the package delivery guys are taking all the parking tickets, that's generating millions of dollars of municipal funds, which is just an interesting way that in the world of irony, that .com is funding municipalities. I want to talk about this idea you brought up early on about this minimal viable product. I'm borrowing that phrase from our friends in technology, where, the retailers were executing and they were less worried in the early days and today about getting perfection. I was wondering, part of that, I think, is consumers were less demanding. In other words, they were more forgiving of mistakes because everybody knew it was a crisis. Do you think that continues? Do you see anything in your research? Because I've talked to folks at Forrester about, CX and usability, and consumers can be pretty punishing when it comes to small mistakes. So you give a shout out to the folks who are worried about that kind of impact of customer experience on a non-perfect execution. So I think we've gone through this world where consumers' expectations, or again, forgiveness has been expanded. But do you think that will contract as time goes on and we get used to, if you can put it that way, living in the COVID era?
Oh, absolutely. Half of Twitter is consumer complaints about something or another, right? So yes, like people will complain about everything under the sun, and retail has to respond more than healthcare, more than airlines, more than every other sector, because it's much more competitive. And, kind of unlike, a lot of industries where I don't have a choice, like in healthcare, and they can treat me terribly and I can complain all I want, but, nothing happens. That's not the case in retail, where you have, 150 other options for getting whatever it is that you want. So the bar is absolutely higher. It's been higher for retail. That's one of the things. That's why retail is such a difficult industry, and why it does have so many challenges with margins. But as a retailer, that's why it's also incredibly important to have something unique about you. And a lot of that comes from unique product, if nothing else. Now,
something remarkable, I might even say. Something remarkable, perhaps.
Exactly.
Interesting concept.
Exactly. And that's the problem, is that so many companies just have not, they have the same commoditized look and feel. They have the same commoditized products. They have, store associates that they pay below market rates, and, kind of how the heck are you going to get anything remarkable when that's your strategy?
Right.
Yeah. I call that the strategy of delivering a slightly better version of mediocre. It's such an incremental
if it's that
improvement.
Picking up on something else you said, that Forrester had revised your forecasts, and you're talking about retail or e-commerce that advanced in 2 years. What's your advice to retailers and retail industry insiders listening about forecasting in such an uncertain environment? How do you get your head around planning in the COVID era?
Well, there is no easy answer. This is the reason why AI is so tough in scenarios like this, right? It's only as good as what you can infer from things that have happened in the past that are somewhat similar. So I'll tell you what Forrester did is that we are a global company, and we've had a fairly significant Asia presence for some time. So we were able to take some of the insights from previous pandemics. So looking at SARS, looking at MERS, looking at bird flu, which all affected Asia a bit more than North America or Europe. And looking at, the cadence of how sales were in those markets, looking at how consumer confidence was in those markets, what categories people purchased or didn't purchase. But it's still hard, right? Because SARS was in the very, very early days of the internet. There was no social media then. There was a lot that was very different then. So you do have to look at kind of what else can you model? We looked at a little bit of the behavioral changes that we saw from 9/11, even though that wasn't the best proxy for what's happening now, but kind of looking a little bit at how some of those metrics that happened subsequent to September in 2001, look what happened to sales and different sectors of the economy, and then you pull data points from wherever you can, whether it's kind of consumer sentiment after the 2016 election, or whether it was what happened in 08, 09. And, you take your best crack at a model. I mean, forecasting models are art and science. And, when you're prognosticating something that's completely unknown, it tends to be more art than science, frankly.
Do you feel like one of the things that occurs to me, aside from just when we're going to have a vaccine or treatments that really make people fundamentally feel more comfortable going back to stores, do you feel like, particularly in the U.S. with so much overcapacity of physical retail, that's going to put even more pressure on certain markets than others?
Oh, for sure. And I think that it should accelerate the shakeout, because we've been talking about a shakeout for how long now? And you have, kind of two sectors in particular that have been most hard hit. One is the mall sector and apparel merchants in particular. Their margins are a little higher, and, a number of them have, if they're not in debt because they're owned by private equity, they have been able to draw down pretty substantial lines of credit, and that should buy them a little bit of time. But those that are in debt are absolutely going to shake out. And you see kind of new companies declaring bankruptcy almost on a weekly basis now. Yep. But the other sector is the restaurants, and they don't have these enormous lines of credit. They had like the PPP funds, and that's going to maybe pull some of them through the next few months, and then it's done. And, if they don't get their traffic back, it's over for them.
And winter is coming.
Yes, exactly. So there's no outdoor seating. Exactly. Yeah. So, so it's going to be tough, and there will be a reckoning, and it'll take a while to rebuild. But on the other hand, entrepreneurialism, retail in this country is pretty resilient. And there are a lot of retail entrepreneurs that will pretty quickly, I think, come in to occupy the space of those that have departed.
Well, Sucharita, that's a great way to wrap up a great conversation, that note of optimism. It's been so fascinating listening to you, and rewarding to hear that even Forrester has to have a little art mixed in with their science in these days. So thanks so much for being on the Remarkable Retail Podcast, our inaugural interview. Really appreciate you joining us, and I wish you a safe week.
Thank you so much.
What a great interview. I mean, Steve, what jumped out at you? What jumped out at me, and the concept of this change and remarkable, was this idea that retailers could and move quickly, and found this bias to move quickly, this minimal viable product, as I described it, and this this closing of the execution gap, as Sucharita described it. The Department of No kind of went aside because you had this massive change that just got out of the way, and there's just this acceleration in another way that retailers finally found less excuse to do things like curbside and just got it done. That's one of the things that jumped out at me from the interview.
I agree. I have really mixed feelings about all this innovation we're seeing, because on the one hand, I think it's been fantastic for consumers in a lot of cases. Obviously not for the best underlying reasons, but we've seen quite a lot of creativity on the part of retailers. And perhaps that gives some of them the muscle memory, or whatever you want to call it, to be more innovative going forward. But at the same time, it just bugs me that so many retailers waited for a crisis. I mean, things like buy online, pick up in store, that has been, I guess, more or less morphed in a lot of cases to curbside. But that fundamental idea has been around. I mean, I was working on stuff like that, 10, 12 years ago. And we've seen, as you know, a pretty significant adoption. And I think it's pretty clear in most cases that customers really like it. Now, it is more complicated and more expensive for retailers to execute, which I suppose is why they waited. But I just wonder how many retailers could have had a real competitive edge if they had pushed this innovation. I mean, they still were going to have a hard time by virtue of the pandemic, but the opportunity to gain market share from pushing forward on some of these things, I just think most of them are responsive to trends we saw pretty clearly many years ago.
I think about the pandemic, and I think about just changes in big retail, and that could be just the changes of the competitive set. The world turned upside down. The black swan event. Speak to that for a little bit. You've mentioned that a couple of times off mic as you think through what has happened, and as you think through the emerging forces, the five different emerging forces. Bring those kind of thoughts together for me and help set the table here.
As Sucharita was alluding to too, I mean, we've seen a tremendous amount of disruption and an acceleration of a lot of these trends before the crisis, but then clearly the shutting down of stores in particular, and this definition between essential and non-essential retailers so characterized the way retail has performed over the past 6 months, and presumably will still continue for a while. So if listeners aren't familiar, the idea of a black swan event is an event that comes kind of out of left field, is largely unexpected, though we could probably argue about that. But certainly the timing of it, and has massive impacts, and its impacts have pretty significant effect on how things unfold in the future. So I certainly think the COVID-19 crisis fits that. And one of the quotes I've been using lately is from the great retail strategist Mike Tyson, who says, everybody has a strategy until they get punched in the face. And,
right on.
And so, clearly this has been a punch in the face for retailers, and they've spent a lot of time, most of them anyway, really in reaction mode, and trying to do what they can to, in some cases, stay out of bankruptcy and liquidation. In other cases, just simply respond to the world they're in and trying to meet customer needs. And so I mean, it's clearly incredibly disruptive. And, I think there are some fundamental forces that I think are going to be with us for a while that are maybe a little bit different than some of the trends we saw coming into the crisis.
You talked to Sucharita about why it takes a crisis for retailers to innovate. As you described, curbside is hardly innovative. I was working on it at Hudson's Bay in the 99s, 2000s. I mean, there's nothing innovative about it, nor is there anything innovative about curbside. But, this department you've been at the top levels of strategy and innovation at very large retailers. So you can bring us an inside out view. What does it take, or asked differently, why does it take a crisis for innovation to happen in many, many retailers? I
think Sucharita called it the Department of No. I often say, is the culture fundamentally wired to say yes or wired to say no, which I think is a similar idea. I think a lot of big retailers culturally, they defend the status quo. And so if taking risk is not part of the culture, or in fact, you might get criticized or fired for an experiment that doesn't work, that has pretty widespread effects. The other thing I think, and I talk about this a little bit in the book, is this idea of, well, it's one thing to be aware of what's going on in the marketplace in terms of competitive impact, changing customer behavior, impacts of technology, and so forth. It's another thing to accept the reality. And then the last thing is whether you act on it. And what I've seen, both working at a couple big retailers, but also somewhat in my consulting business, is most businesses are pretty good at being aware of what's going on. But the real acceptance about how profoundly it might change their business usually isn't there. And then, they may not be set up to act because they don't really have an innovation budget. They don't have people that know how to prototype and scale ideas and so forth. So I think it's a complicated equation in terms of what it takes to be more innovative at legacy retailers. But I just think it's been interesting because you can certainly look back for at least 2 or 3 decades and see plenty of these leading retailers who basically watched while their future happened to them, right? I mean,
right.
When I worked at Sears a bazillion years ago, it wasn't news to us that Home Depot, Lowe's, Best Buy, others were taking market share from us in our 2 big categories, which were major appliances and tools. That we knew that was happening, but we didn't act to do anything about it that was really substantive enough. Or some of the things that we thought would work, clearly were not going to be significant enough to really counteract the threat.
What is it that you thought held you back? Not you as an individual, but the Sears organization. I'm looking at your book, and there's a great chart in here. Up until 1980, Sears was the number 1 retailer, I think, in the world. Yeah. It was massive. So is it just that, well, listen, we're so big, I can't imagine that taking us down. Is it, what holds, I was in the hardware sector myself, and I worked for Black & Decker, and you can just see the big box retailers just taking share away from the traditional department store. The Sears Craftsman is such a proud line, now owned by Black & Decker and now at Lowe's. I just bought a piece just for thinking about the work I did with Sears and Craftsman at Black & Decker. But take me into that meeting. Like, what is it that says, listen, this train is coming, and why can't we step aside from it or do something different? Yeah, well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I think the big one, which certainly others have talked about, Clayton Christensen, Innovator's Dilemma is a great book. It's a lot to do with protecting the dinosaur. With the mothership, a lot of the ideas that we looked at back in the 90s, early 2000s, really we were worried about cannibalizing, for lack of a better term, our core mall business. And often also what it would take to really bring something truly innovative was quite expensive. So in Sears' case, the answer, I think, for a lot of their problems was Sears should have gotten into the home improvement warehouse business before Home Depot and Lowe's and others really secured that. But to do so really said, okay, we're going to create a multi-billion-dollar business to compete with our existing $30, $40 billion business, right, on the mall. And so we ended up, I think, going after quite a few half measures to try to counteract that. And really it was, I think we can certainly see this with aspects of what's going on today in terms of some of these new business models, whether it's Amazon or some more specialized formats, which are just better distribution strategies. And trying to protect your outdated distribution strategy is ultimately what I think you can see almost every retailer that's gotten into trouble. That was kind of the underlying problem, whether they saw it coming or not. They certainly were not aggressive about competing with themselves, essentially. In addition to writing this great book and being an author and speaker, you also write for Forbes. So I wanted to end off this episode just talking about an article you wrote or penned talking about the 5 emerging forces of retail's new normal. So that kind of brings us into more or less the current state. What are those 5 things? Take us through these 5 new emerging forces for retail. Sure. So I actually regret using the term new normal, not only because it's cliche, but also I think there is no normal anymore, probably. But the 5 forces that I suspect will be with us some more than others. The first is what I call bifurcation 2.0. So we were talking about this bifurcation effect, the collapse of the middle. And I think that we're really seeing a pronounced difference between the winners and losers in this market. And a lot of that certainly has to do with many brands around the world not being able to sustain a 30, 40, 50% drop in business, particularly if they had a lot of debt. So the JCPenney's of the world and others that were already struggling are really getting caught up. So I think the bifurcation of retail will continue. I think, frankly, it's also an economic perspective in a lot of markets where the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, or, particularly struggling through this crisis. So that has some spending impacts as well as obviously the human impact. The second one is contraction. Now, we haven't seen
quite as much overall contraction in spending in the U.S. anyway, because there's been an enormous amount of government stimulus. But that's basically come to an end or won't be as significant. So I think we'll as long as there's economic hardship, I think the aggregate level of spending in most categories will be muted for a while. But the third one is this really significant reallocation of spending. So Sucharita alluded to this. One is just this shift from eating out to eating at home, which is driving disproportionate grocery spending, right? You've got huge. I think work from home is probably the most profound, because not only are people buying new office furniture and redecorating their bathroom if they have the money, and some of these things saying, well, I'm going to be spending a lot more time at my house, so I want to make it as nice as I can afford. But also huge impact on apparel. I was talking to somebody earlier today about when you look at some of the high-end retailers, whether you're talking about a Nordstrom or Neiman Marcus or many specialty shops, a lot of that business is driven by getting clothing or an outfit for an occasion. It's date night or going on a trip or job interview or
big meeting, right. Brooks Brothers got it, and all those weddings, all those things that we used to do together, right?
Right. So I think as long as many of those events are not happening or happening much less frequently, you're going to see a shift away from sort of nicer clothes, for lack of a better term, to much more casual athleisure, those sort of things. So I think some significant reallocation, even if spending comes back in aggregate, in terms of how it gets spent. The fourth one, which a lot of people talk about, is just, and we talked about with Sucharita, is just the acceleration of a lot of these trends. So while I think people got a little drunk and disorderly around 10 years of e-commerce growth happening, I think it's going to be much closer to 2 or 3. But
I liked your idea of 2. I like that.
I think
2 is a nice number.
Yeah, I think that's in aggregate going to be more accurate. Certainly it'll affect different sectors a little bit different, but a lot of, like we were talking about, the deployment of buy online, pick up in store, contactless payment. I think there are a lot of trends that have been significantly accelerated, whether it's a couple of years or 5 years. And then the last one quickly is consolidation. And I think we're already, I wrote that back in May, I think we're already seeing this consolidation pick up, which is if retailers go out of business, that market share moving to the ones that are able to stay in business. So market share will become more concentrated, but also companies, whether it's financial companies or strategic buyers, making acquisitions, because we're seeing a lot of fundamentally pretty good assets available for fire sale prices. So I think, again, it's unfortunate, because I think a lot of poorly capitalized businesses, or just businesses like restaurants, as Sucharita talked about, which just don't have the kind of capital structure to withstand a prolonged downturn in environment, will unfortunately either scale back massively or go away. So that'll cause that share to shift substantially to the remaining players.
Well, I like the way that we ended our interview with Sucharita on that kind of high note, or a positive note, where the great entrepreneurial class that makes up retailers, and you and I have been in the retail sector for decades, great entrepreneurs. So I think we end our conversation today in the first episode on that note of optimism, right? That is, as much as there's consolidation, there's going to be opening up of opportunities, and I think it gives us an opportunity, so to speak, to talk about it for the rest of this series. So I'm excited. Looking forward to it. For now, let's thank our special guest, Sucharita Kodali from Forrester Research, for being our guest on this very first episode of the Remarkable Retail Podcast. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. Please rate and review, and be sure to recommend to a friend or colleague in the retail, brand, or CPG industry. I'm Michael LeBlanc, producer and host of the Voice of Retail Podcast.
And I'm Steve Dennis.
Thanks, everyone, for listening, and have a safe week.